The 23rd of January 1944. The pre-dawn darkness over the Bismarck Sea lay heavy and unmoving, broken only by the slow pulse of red signal lamps along the decks of American PT boats riding low in the water. The air smelled of fuel oil, salt, and tropical rot. Engines idled at a whisper, vibrating through thin holes built for speed rather than survival. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Japanese shipping moved under the assumption that the night still belonged to them. On one of those boats stood a young American commander, his eyes fixed forward, jaw set, hands resting lightly on the throttles. He had been warned formally and repeatedly that what he intended to do was reckless. Doctrine said no. Regulation said no. Experience said no. A 50-foot run straight into enemy fire was not bravery. It was waste. It exposed the boat too long, too close, too predictably. The maneuver had been labeled suicidal, officially discouraged, quietly banned. Yet the sea ahead told a different story, and the man at the controls had learned, through bitter nights and empty wakes, that Japanese captains did not expect Americans to break their own rules. The Pacific War had entered a grinding phase by this point. The early chaos had given way to attrition. Islands were being bypassed, strangled rather than stormed. Supply lines mattered more than banners. For Japan, whose empire stretched across thousands of miles of ocean, shipping was the bloodstream. Oil from Borneo, food from Southeast Asia, ammunition from the home islands, everything moved by sea. American submarines were beginning to bite deep. But in the shallow coastal waters and narrow straits of the Southwest Pacific, submarines were less effective. That gap fell to small, fragile craft that rarely appeared in strategic overviews, patrol torpedo boats. PT boats were never meant to win wars. They were meant to harass, delay, confuse. Yet by 1944, they were being asked to do far more. Japanese sailors understood PT boats as fast nuisances, mosquitoes armed with torpedoes that were dangerous only if they managed a clean approach. Japanese escorts trained to expect hit-and-run attacks from long range. Torpedoes fired at distance, followed by immediate withdrawal. Their gunners were drilled to repel exactly that kind of assault. What they did not expect was an American commander willing to close the distance until there was no room left for error. The 50-foot run was simple in concept and terrifying in execution. Instead of firing torpedoes from hundreds of yards away, the PT boat would charge directly toward the target, engine screaming, bow lifted, wake blazing white in the darkness. At 50 feet, sometimes less, the torpedoes would be launched point blank, leaving almost no time for evasive action. It turned the PT boat into a blunt instrument, gambling its thin wooden hull against steel ships bristling with guns. Senior officers argued that the risk outweighed the reward. PT boats were scarce. Crews were irreplaceable. Losing one boat for one ship was unacceptable. The maneuver disappeared from training manuals, replaced by safer, more orthodox tactics. But reality at sea did not reward orthodoxy. Japanese convoys continued to slip through contested waters at night, hugging coastlines, using reefs and narrow channels where larger Allied ships dared not follow. Each successful run fed the Japanese garrison still resisting across the Pacific. Each night that passed without disruption prolonged the war. The commander had watched torpedoes miss from long range. He had seen wakes spotted and avoided. He had seen enemy ships turn calmly away while PT boats fled under fire. And he had reached a conclusion that no memo could erase. Distance favored the defender. The symbol of his thinking was not a map or a chart, but the throttle itself. Worn smooth by countless hours of vibration, it represented American abundance in motion engines powerful enough to risk everything on speed, fuel plentiful enough to burn it without hesitation. Where Japanese boats conserved, American boats could expend. On the night that would later be dissected in reports and rumors, intelligence indicated a Japanese transport group moving through a confined stretch of water, lightly escorted but confident in darkness. The PT boats moved into position silently, engines throttled down, crews tense, The plan on paper called for standard attack runs. Fire, peel away, regroup. The commander listened, nodded, and waited. When the silhouettes appeared, dark shapes against darker water, he felt the familiar narrowing of focus. This was not defiance for its own sake. It was calculation sharpened by necessity. He pushed the throttles forward. The engines roared, shattering the quiet. Spray flew over the bow. Tracers began to arc from the Japanese ships almost immediately, orange lines slashing through blackness. At this distance, there was no concealment left. Only momentum. Japanese gunners reacted as trained. They expected the PT boat to veer off, to launch from afar. Instead, it kept coming. The 50-foot run compressed time. Seconds felt physical, heavy. The torpedo officer waited until the last possible moment, until the target filled his vision, until there was nowhere left to aim but center mass. The launch was violent, the recoil shuddering through the hull. The explosion that followed was not dramatic in the cinematic sense. It was efficient. Steel ruptured. Fire blossomed low and fast. The transport slowed, listed, and began to die. The PT boat did not slow. It passed so close that debris rattled against its sides. Another torpedo struck a second ship moments later. Then another dot in 15 minutes. 8 Japanese ships were burning, sinking, or drifting helplessly. The water was choked with wreckage and oil. Survivors clung to debris, shouting into a night that no longer answered. Japanese officers who survived that encounter struggled to explain it. Reports described reckless American attack at suicidal range. The tone betrayed confusion more than anger. Doctrine had failed to predict behavior that violated its assumptions. American after-action reports were more restrained. They listed targets destroyed, torpedoes expended, damage sustained. Only in the margins did the true impact appear. The maneuver, once dismissed as suicidal, had achieved a result no cautious approach had managed. The ban was not lifted. Immediately, institutions changed slowly. But quietly, the 50-foot run returned not as an official tactic, but as an understood option. A tool reserved for moments when restraint achieved nothing. The transformation was not merely tactical. It was psychological. PT crews began to see their boats not as expendable irritants, but as weapons capable of decisive effect. Japanese sailors, for their part, began to fear waters they had once considered safe. Darkness no longer guaranteed distance. The sound that lingered from that night was not the explosions. It was the engine's full throttle, unhesitating. A sound of confidence rooted in capacity. The ability to burn fuel, to risk hulls, to replace losses. Abundance expressed not as excess, but as freedom of choice. As the war progressed, Japanese shipping losses mounted. Each sunk transport meant fewer supplies, fewer reinforcements, less endurance. Small actions accumulated into strategic collapse. The PT boats would never headline the war, but their impact was real and measurable. The Japanese Navy did not initially understand what had happened that night. Reports arrived fragmented, delayed by damaged radios, and the sudden absence of ships that were supposed to arrive on schedule. Harbor masters waited. Signals went unanswered. Dawn revealed oil slicks where steel should have been dotted first. Commanders assumed a submarine attack. That was the established threat. Submarines struck unseen, vanished beneath the surface, and left confusion behind. But sonar logs showed nothing. Escort captains reported surface contacts moving too fast, too close, too brazen. The details did not align with expectation. That dissonance mattered. Japanese naval doctrine rested heavily on predictability, both their own and the enemy's. They believed Americans would fight cautiously in confined waters, respecting the limitations of small craft. PT boats were categorized as harassment tools, dangerous only if mishandled by inattentive crews. They were not expected to break formations, let alone shatter them. Yet 8 ships lay wrecked out in subsequent days. Japanese convoy commanders altered procedures. Escorts tightened their screens. Gunners were ordered to open fire earlier, even at uncertain targets. Fuel consumption rose sharply as ships zigzagged through waters once navigated directly. Every adjustment carried a cost. American intelligence noticed the change almost immediately. Intercepted communications revealed increased anxiety, longer transit times, requests for additional escorts that could not be spared. A single engagement had begun to ripple outward, distorting an already strained system. For the Point Cruz, the effect was more personal. Word spread quietly along the docks. Not boastfully, not officially, but with the weight of proof. The 50-foot run had worked not once, but decisively. The idea that had been dismissed as suicidal now carried a different label: effective. The commanders who had banned it were not foolish men. They understood probabilities. They knew how thin a PT boat's hull truly was: layers of plywood, reinforced just enough to survive speed, not gunfire. They knew a single shell could turn a boat into splinters. Their caution was rational, but war is not fought in averages. It is fought in moments. The symbolic object of that transformation was the torpedo itself. American torpedoes were heavy, powerful, and increasingly reliable by 1944. They represented industrial patience, the willingness to fix flaws, refine designs, and deliver weapons that worked as intended. Fired from 50 feet, their destructive potential became undeniable. Japanese torpedoes, feared earlier in the war, were designed for fleet engagements, not sudden point-blank chaos. Their doctrine assumed distance, coordination, and control. The 50-foot run erased all three. In later interrogations, Japanese survivors spoke of confusion more than terror. They described attackers who did not withdraw, who did not hesitate, who seemed unconcerned with return fire. That perception mattered. It suggested not desperation, but confidence. Confidence born of abundance. The United States could afford to lose boats. Japan could not afford to lose ships. That imbalance did not mean Americans were careless with lives, but it did mean they could accept risks that Japan, by 1944, could no longer absorb. Every sunk transport represented weeks of lost labor, fuel that could not be replaced, crews that could not be retrained quickly enough. The 50-foot run became part of that equation. It forced Japanese planners to defend against a threat that violated geometry. How do you guard against an enemy who ignores the safe distance? How do you design doctrine around unpredictability? The answer for Japan was hesitation. And hesitation at sea is fatal. American PT squadrons did not suddenly adopt reckless behavior across the board. Most attacks remained cautious. But the possibility lingered. Japanese crews knew now that any dark shape moving fast might not peel away. It might keep coming. That uncertainty slowed convoys more effectively than any single torpedo dot by mid-1944. Japanese shipping losses in contested waters accelerated. The reasons were many: submarines, aircraft, mines, but the pressure from small craft compounded everything. PT boats forced escorts to divide attention, to react early, to burn fuel and ammunition defensively. The war beneath the strategy grew heavier. The commander who had pushed the throttles forward did not become famous. His action fit poorly into grand narratives. It was too specific, too situational, too uncomfortable for doctrine. But among those who mattered, sailors who navigated those waters, it changed expectations. What had once been mocked as suicide became understood as resolve. And resolve, when paired with resources, reshapes battlefields far beyond its point of origin. The effect of that night did not fade with daylight. It settled instead into calculations, into altered behavior, into the subtle erosion of confidence that no after-action report could fully capture. Japanese convoy commanders began to feel watched even when no enemy appeared. The sea itself seemed less neutral, less predictable. Naval planners attempted to adapt. Escort formations were widened, then tightened again. Lookouts were rotated more frequently, their vigilance stretched thin by long nights and mounting fatigue. Orders emphasized aggression: fire early, fire often, but this only compounded the problem. Ammunition stocks dwindled faster. Barrels overheated. Crews fired at shadows, mistaking waves and floating debris for incoming attackers. The Japanese Navy had long believed that night belonged to discipline, that training, repetition, and hierarchy could master darkness. But the 50-foot run inverted that belief. Darkness now favored the side willing to act first, to compress decision-making until reaction became impossible. Historical records from early 1944 show a measurable shift. Convoys delayed departures to await additional escorts that never arrived. Routes were lengthened to avoid narrow passages, increasing transit time and fuel consumption. In some cases, shipments were canceled entirely, judged too risky to attempt. Each delay weakened forward garrisons. Already living on reduced rations, American intelligence officers noted the trend with cautious satisfaction. Intercepts revealed increasing concern within Japanese naval commands about close-range surface attack. The phrasing itself was telling. It acknowledged a threat they had not previously taken seriously. It admitted vulnerability. For the Point Cruz, this growing hesitation manifested as opportunity. Fewer ships moving meant clearer targets. Slower convoys meant longer engagement windows. The sea, once crowded with traffic, began to thin. The recurring sound that defined these patrols was not gunfire, but engines at full throttle and unbroken roar that announced intent. American boats could afford to run hard to burn fuel without counting every gallon. Supply chains followed them even into remote forward bases. Fuel drums waited. Replacement parts arrived. Crews rotated out before exhaustion hollowed them. This, more than any single tactic, embodied the deeper imbalance of the war. Japanese sailors fought with resolve, but resolve could not replace fuel. Courage could not substitute for steel. Discipline could not generate spare parts. The 50-foot run exposed that truth brutally. It forced the Japanese Navy into a defensive posture that contradicted its self-image. Instead of dictating engagement terms, it reacted. Instead of imposing order, it absorbed disruption. By mid-1944, American PT squadrons were credited with dozens of ships damaged or sunk across the Southwest Pacific. Few matched the concentrated destruction of that initial 15-minute engagement, but the cumulative effect was undeniable. Each patrol carried the possibility, not certainty, but possibility of sudden, decisive violence. Japanese sailors began referring to certain coastal passages with unease. These were waters once considered routine, now approached cautiously. The night, which had been an ally, became suspect. The idea that a small, fast craft might appear suddenly, closing without hesitation, unsettled even experienced crews. This psychological shift mattered as much as the physical losses. War depends on expectation. When expectation fails, reaction slows. Orders are questioned internally. Confidence erodes quietly, invisibly. American doctrine absorbed the lesson indirectly. Official manuals did not celebrate the 50-foot run, but training increasingly emphasized initiative. Commanders were encouraged to assess situations dynamically rather than adhere rigidly to prescribed distances and formations. The emphasis shifted from avoidance of loss to exploitation of advantage. The transformation was subtle but lasting. It reflected a broader ideological contrast between the two navies. One valued adherence to form. The other increasingly rewarded outcome. The symbol of that difference remained the torpedo, unchanged in appearance, unchanged in function, but employed with a different philosophy. Fired from afar, it was a weapon of chance. Fired from 50 feet, it became a statement of intent. Japanese post-war analyzers acknowledged the difficulty. One report noted that American small craft demonstrated an unexpected willingness to sacrifice safety for certainty. The phrasing implied misunderstanding. It framed the tactic as recklessness rather than calculation, yet the results spoke clearly. Japanese shipping losses continued to mount. Forward units went without supplies. Repairs were delayed. The logistical scaffolding of the empire weakened under constant, asymmetric pressure. the commander whose decision had sparked this chain of events remained largely absent from official histories. He received no sweeping commendation, no symbolic elevation. His contribution fit poorly into the language of grand strategy. But among sailors, his name carried weight. It represented the moment when hesitation gave way to action. The sea does not remember names. It remembers patterns. And the pattern had changed. Where once Japanese convoys moved with expectation of distance, they now moved with fear of proximity. Where once PT boats were dismissed as arrogance, they were now treated as threats. The 50-foot run had not rewritten the war, but it had rewritten the night, and in war, sometimes that is enough.